My mother always said the wolves were nothing to fear. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without drama, as though the truth were a simple thing that only needed stating once to stick. She said it when Lord Harwick's soldiers first started riding through our village with their iron-tipped crossbows and their borrowed authority. She said it when our neighbors began locking their shutters at dusk. She kept saying it right up until the night Harwick's men put a torch to her cottage and she with it, and then she could not say anything at all. She was wrong about many things, my mother. She was wrong about Lord Harwick's patience, wrong about the goodness of powerful men, wrong about how long courage without caution could survive in a world that punishes the soft-hearted. But about the wolves, I think she was right. I think she was always right about the wolves, and I am only sorry it took me this long to understand it. The night it began was a dusk like any other in Ashvin. The sky pressed down iron gray over the village, and smoke curled from every chimney, and somewhere in the hills to the east, a wolf was howling, had been howling for 3 nights running, low and carrying, the kind of sound that reaches into the chest and pulls at something old. The villagers were frightened. They banged their shutters closed and muttered about omens, and whispered that Harwick's men were right, that the Thornwood wolves were a plague that needed ending. I was not frightened. I was grinding yarrow at my work table by candlelight, doing what healers do, which is work, and thinking about my mother and listening to the howling with something I could not quite name. Not comfort, exactly. Something older than comfort. Then there was a crash outside, heavy and wet and wrong, and I grabbed the knife from the block before I had consciously decided to move. I eased the cottage door open. Cold air rushed in, smelling of pine and blood. He was collapsed against my garden wall. Enormous. I had known wolves were large, heard the stories, but knowing and seeing are entirely different countries. Black from nose to tail, coat like deep water, and bleeding from a crossbow bolt lodged deep and vicious in his left flank. The blood had already darkened the frost on the stones beneath him. His eyes found mine. Amber, lit from within, extraordinary. Not wild. Not the eyes of a mindless animal driven to the edge by pain. Something looked out of those eyes with terrible intelligence, and what looked out at me was recognition. As though he had known I would open this door. I did not run. I am not sure why. Perhaps my mother's voice in the back of my skull, perhaps the particular stillness of those amber eyes, perhaps simply the fact that a healer who runs from the injured is no healer at all. Whatever the reason, I crouched slowly and held my hands open at my sides the way she taught me with wounded animals, and I said, "You are going to die out here in the cold if I leave you. And something tells me that would be a very large problem for a great many people." His nostrils flared. A low sound built in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite anything I had a word for. I decided it was permission. Pulling a crossbow bolt from a wound is not a task that improves with hesitation, so I did not hesitate. I packed the wound with yarrow and river moss and pressed my palm flat against his side until I felt the bleeding slow, and the whole time he held perfectly still beneath my hands with a self-possession that I found, even then, even in my terror and exhaustion, quietly astonishing. I sat back on my heels when it was done. The wolf breathed steadily. The candles had burned low. Outside, the village was silent. Then the sound came, not a sound so much as a shift in the world's texture, a low resonance like the lowest string of a lute plucked once, and the wolf was no longer a wolf. I scrambled backward and hit the far wall and stared. A man lay on my hearthrug, tall, even horizontal, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the room feel smaller. Dark hair tangled against the stone, a jaw like something cut from cliff face. A scar, livid, long, speaking of something terrible survived, that ran from beneath his left eye all the way to the base of his neck. He was alive. He was breathing. He was wearing absolutely nothing. I stared at the ceiling for a considerable moment. "There's a blanket," I said, with great precision. "On the chair. To your left. I would strongly suggest you use it." His voice, when it came, was hoarse and slow, a man surfacing from depth. "Where am I?" "My cottage, where you bled extensively on my best hearthrug." A pause. The sound of fabric moving. "You pulled the bolt." "Someone had to." I looked down from the ceiling. He was sitting up, the blanket arranged with a dignity that I found almost funny given the circumstances. His amber eyes, the same amber, I realized with a jolt, the same exact amber, found mine across the dim room, and for a moment neither of us moved at all. "You're not afraid," he said. It was not a question. "I'm furious," I said. "There's a difference. Most humans would have left me to die. Most humans would have. I'm a healer. I don't get to choose which lives are worth saving." I stood and moved to the fire to give my hands something useful to do. "Who are you?" He studied me for a long moment before answering. "Caedran Duskmore. Thornwood Pack." The Thornwood Pack. The wolves Harwick's men had been hunting for 3 months. The wolves who had refused to yield the ancient forest to a lord who wanted the timber and had the soldiers to take it. The wolves my mother had spoken of with such uncomplicated respect. "The Alpha," I said. Not a question either. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly, but recalibration, the adjustment a person makes when the world has not behaved as expected. He had not given his rank. "Yes. His hunters will have tracked the blood trail. You cannot stay here." "I know." He tried to stand. I watched his legs decide not to cooperate, watched him start to go down, and caught his arm before I could think better of it. His skin was extraordinarily warm, not fever warm, something deeper than that, a heat that seemed to come from the core of him rather than the surface. I held on for a moment I could not entirely account for, my hand wrapped around his forearm, his weight coming against me, both of us very still. "You'll reopen the wound," I said. "I know that too," he said. "Quiet. Close." I released him. There is a root cellar beneath the floorboards. Dry, hidden, a single night's safety. That is all I can offer. "Why are you helping me?" I looked at him directly, because I owed him a direct answer. My mother believed in the old covenant between healers and wolves. Lord Harwick killed her for it. So perhaps I have reasons of my own. He held my gaze for a long moment. In the candlelight, his eyes were the color of autumn, gold and deep amber, and something darker at the edges. "The covenant still stands, Lyra Ashwood," he said. "Whatever the human lords have told you." I had not told him my name. "Get in the cellar," I said. "His outriders are coming." Lord Harwick arrived at my door 20 minutes later with 6 armed men and torches that turned the fog orange. He was handsome in the way that had gone sour, a man who had been told he was exceptional for so long that his face had rearranged itself around the certainty of it. He looked at me with the particular attention of a man accustomed to finding what he was looking for. "A wounded wolf was tracked to this road," he said. "Large. Black. Have you seen it?" "I have not," I said. "I've been asleep." "You're a terrible liar, girl. And you're a terrible lord," I said. "We all have our crosses to bear." He pushed past me into the cottage. His men spread through the small rooms with the practiced ease of people accustomed to searching other people's spaces. Harwick found the hearthrug, still stained, I had not had time, and crouched to press 2 fingers into the dark. "Blood. I treated a carter with a gashed hand this evening," I said. "I told you. I'm a healer." He stood slowly, came very close, close enough that I could smell torch smoke on his coat, and something underneath it, cold and calculating. "Do not make an enemy of me, Lyra," he said, very quietly. "Your mother's fate should be lesson enough." Something moved through me at that, cold and clarifying, like the moment a clouded sky breaks. Not fear. I had already been afraid of him, had been afraid since the night he burned my mother's life to ash. What I felt in that moment was something closer to decision. "Good night, my lord," I said. He held my gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable, then turned and walked out into the fog. His men filed after him. The door closed. Silence. Then, from beneath the floorboards, a single soft creak. He had heard every word. Caedran emerged from the root cellar at first light wearing borrowed clothes from the charity chest, a rough linen shirt that pulled across his shoulders, trousers meant for a smaller man, boots that did not fit. He looked faintly ridiculous and entirely undimmed by it. Some people carry their authority in their clothing. He carried his in his bones. I was already awake, preparing a fresh poultice. He stood in the doorway between the cellar and the main room and watched me work in silence until I said, without turning around, "Sit. I need to check the wound. It's already healing. Sit anyway." He sat. I moved behind him and pressed careful fingers around the wound site, checking the edges, feeling for heat that might signal corruption. He went very still at the touch, not tense, not resistant, simply still, in the way of someone exercising considerable restraint. His shoulders were broad and scarred in ways that told long, difficult stories, and I found myself reading them without meaning to, parsing the old violence written into his skin. The wolfsbane in that bolt was diluted, I said, mostly to give myself something to do with the silence. He doesn't know enough yet to kill you properly. He's learning. How long has he been hunting your pack? 3 months. Since we refused to cede the Thornwood to him. He wants the forest. He wants everything, Caedran said. The forest first, then the farmlands to the north, then whatever adjoins them. Men like Harwick are not satisfied by the thing they have, only by the taking of it. I stepped back. I had been touching him for longer than medically necessary, and I was not prepared to examine why. You should leave before the road fills. His men patrol at sunrise. I can't leave yet. You certainly can. Lyra. My name in his voice had a particular quality I could not account for, weighted, deliberate, like a key turned in a lock. I looked at him. My second in command, he said.
Soren.
He was with me when I was shot. He ran into the Thornwood, but I lost him in the dark. I need to know he's alive before I can go back to my pack. I understood before he said the rest. You want me to go into the forest. I want you to be a messenger. Humans can move freely where my wolves cannot right now, not with Harwick's garrison on the road. I won't ask this without offering something in return. He reached into the pocket of the borrowed coat and produced a small carved token, stone, a wolf's head, old workmanship worn smooth by many hands over many years. He held it out across the table. The covenant mark, he said. Any wolf in the Thornwood will know it. You'll be protected in that forest for as long as I draw breath. I took it from his hand. Our fingers met in the transfer, and neither of us pulled back immediately. The stone was warm from his pocket. And when you stopped drawing breath? I asked. The corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. The place where a smile might someday live if given the right conditions. I am very difficult to kill. I've been told this repeatedly. By whom? Mostly by the things that have tried. I closed my fingers around the token and stood up. One condition. Name it. When this is over, when Soren is found, when your pack is safe, I want answers. About the covenant. About what my mother knew and what it cost her. All of it. He met my eyes without hesitation. All of it, he agreed. The Thornwood in the early morning was a different world entirely from the village at its edge. The village was all shudders and suspicion and the smell of hearth smoke and fear. The forest breathed. That was the only word for it, a vast, slow inhalation and exhalation, birdsong threading through the canopy like water. The sense of being watched without menace, observed and found acceptable rather than a threat. I walked with the covenant mark held loose in my palm and my mother's voice in my ear. She had brought me to the Thornwood's edge when I was very small, before everything. She had told me the wolves had kept these lands safe for 400 years. She had told me the covenant was sacred. She had told me that a healer who served a wolf in need would always find wolves who served in kind. I had thought it was a fairy story. Standing in the Thornwood that morning, with the old trees enormous around me and the covenant mark warm in my hand, I began, rather urgently, to revise that opinion. A low whistle from directly above. I had just enough time to look up before Soren dropped from a branch and landed in a combat crouch 6 feet away, amber eyes narrow, a knife already visible at his hip. He was lean where Caedran was broad, sharp-featured, quick-eyed. He clocked the token in my hand and went still. Where did you get that? He said, with a care that told me he already knew the answer mattered enormously. Your alpha is lying on my hearthrug nursing a crossbow wound and asking after you, I said. The relief that moved across Soren's face was unguarded and complete, the expression of someone who had been holding themselves rigid against a fear for hours and had just been given permission to exhale. He's alive. Gods. He pressed the back of his hand briefly to his mouth. Is he? He'll heal. He tells me he's very difficult to kill. He absolutely says that. It's almost true. He studied me with those quick amber eyes, reassessing. You're the healer. The Ashwood woman. Lyra, I said. Yes. Marin spoke of you. The name stopped me. Elder Marin? The Pack's elder? She said the Covenant would wake again through an Ashwood. He tilted his head slightly, curious. She said it the way she says things she's already decided are facts. A slow, reluctant grin spread across his face. Caedran is going to have such a problem with you. I'm not anyone's problem. No, Soren agreed, still grinning. That's exactly the problem. When Soren and I returned to the cottage, Caedran was standing, not sitting, not resting, standing in the center of the room with his arms crossed and his weight evenly distributed, looking like a man who had decided convalescence was not a concept that applied to him. He and Soren gripped forearms when we came through the door, tight and brief, saying in 4 seconds what would have taken either of them 20 minutes to say in words. Then Caedran looked at me, and the expression on his face was the one I was beginning to learn. Fixed attention, a quality of seeing that most people did not have, a stillness of focus that felt, when it turned on you, like being the only thing in a room. Soren reported. Harwick had moved a garrison to the forest road overnight. 6 more soldiers, bringing his total to 20 armed men with more expected by nightfall. A direct confrontation was impossible without risking the Pack, and the Pack was already weakened from 3 months of attrition, living rough in the Thornwood winter. I listened. I thought. And then I said, you might not have to fight at all. Both wolves looked at me with the particular expression of people who have been solving a problem one way for some time and have just been told there might be another way. Harwick's authority in Ashfin rests on a charter from the Duke of Caldenmere, I said. If that charter could be challenged, if someone with standing brought evidence of his crimes to the Duke's court. A healer woman walking into the Duke's court to accuse a lord, Soren said, not dismissively, just precisely. A healer woman with documentation, I said. My mother kept records. Every patient she treated after Harwick's raids. Every scar, every broken bone, every fever that came from burned-out houses in winter with nowhere to go. I have 3 years of her ledgers and boxes under this floor. I paused. The same floor, as it happens, where we hid an alpha last night. I watched Caedran process this. His expression did not change dramatically. He was not a man whose face broadcast much, but something clarified behind his eyes, some internal adjustment being made. That path puts you directly in Harwick's sights, he said. I'm already there. He threatened me last night in my own home, with your blood on my hearthrug and 6 soldiers in my cottage. He threatened you. The words came out measured, but something underneath them was not measured at all. Nothing I couldn't handle. Nothing you should have to handle alone. He said it quietly, without inflection, and somehow that made it more significant rather than less, the way quiet things often are. Soren announced, with the air of a man preserving his own dignity, that he would go check the perimeter. He was through the door before I could register that he was leaving. The cottage felt smaller. Not uncomfortably so. Simply smaller. Caedran crossed the room toward me, slowly, deliberately, his eyes on mine the entire way, giving me every possible moment to step back or look away. I did not step back. I did not look away. He stopped close enough that I could feel the warmth that was intrinsic to him, that extraordinary heat that had nothing to do with proximity to fire. His hand came up and, with careful fingers, he tucked a strand of hair back from my face. Such a small gesture. It undid something in me that I had not known was wound. What are you doing? I asked. My voice was steadier than I had any right to. I'm not entirely sure, he said. And he looked, for the first time, slightly less than entirely certain of himself, which was, I discovered, a far more dangerous quality than his usual composure. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, featherlight. My breath caught in a way I could not prevent, and did not try to. You have a pack to protect, I said. And I have a lord to outmaneuver. This is complicated. Yes, he agreed. You'll be gone by nightfall. He looked at me for a long, still moment. Will I? I stepped back. Not because I wanted to, because some part of me understood that wanting was exactly the problem, and problems needed clear thinking, not warm hands and amber eyes and a jaw like carved stone. He let me go without protest. But his gaze followed me across the room, and I felt it on the back of my neck for a long time after. He brought me to the pack's camp that evening, and I understood, as we walked in through the tree line and the wolves turned to look, that whatever small bravery I had managed in my own cottage was going to be tested in an entirely different way here. They were extraordinary, not monstrous, nothing like the creatures in Harwick's propaganda, nothing like the cautionary tales the village elders told to keep children from wandering at night. They were, unmistakably, people. People who happened to carry something wild and enormous inside them, something that looked out of their eyes with a patience and a depth that most humans never achieve. They watched me with open suspicion and no particular effort to conceal it, which I found, somehow, more respectful than false welcome would have been. Caedran walked beside me through the camp. He did not touch me. He did not speak. But his proximity communicated something to every wolf we passed. I could see them reading it, adjusting their assessment of me based on information I was not privy to. By the time we reached the center of camp, the hostility had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something more like cautious observation. Soren fell into step on my other side. Called it, he murmured to himself, apparently about nothing. You're not checking the perimeter, I said. Finished. I'm efficient. Then Elder Marin stepped from the shadows between two great pines, and the camp went still in the particular way that happens when the most important person in a room has entered it. She was very old and very small. She barely reached my shoulder. She had white hair braided with what looked like crow feathers and barkstrip twigs and perhaps small bones. I decided not to look too closely, and eyes like black coals that burned without diminishing. She looked at me the way very old things sometimes look at you, like she was seeing not just the present version of you, but all the versions that had preceded it and several that had not arrived yet. Lyra Ashwood's daughter, she said. I see your mother in your hands. She had a healer's hands. You knew her, I said. It was not a question. Better than you might suppose. She served the old covenant willingly. A pause, precise as a blade. She died for it. Another pause. Are you prepared for the same? I don't intend to die for anything, I said. Something that might have been approval, or amusement, or the ancient wolfish equivalent of both, flickered across her weathered face. Neither did she. Come. We must speak of the blood moon. In Marin's tent, by a fire that burned low and orange, she laid the covenant parchment flat on the ground between us. It was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that has its own specific smell, dust and time and the oil of countless hands, and covered in script I could not entirely read, interspersed with illustrations of wolves and human figures standing together under a moon rendered in faded red ink. I leaned over it and read what I could while Marin explained what I could not. The covenant had been struck 4 centuries ago, she said, between the Thornwood Pack and the healers of Ashvin, in the years before the human lords came north with their charters and their soldiers. Once each generation, on the night of the blood moon, the bond had to be renewed. A wolf and a healer, willingly bound. A free promise, given on both sides. Their vow renewing the protection over both peoples. The wolves guaranteed safety in the Thornwood. The human village guaranteed the wolves' guardianship against whatever threats moved in the deep forest. What does the binding require? I asked. A free promise. And the mark. Given without coercion, on both sides, on the night itself. I looked at the covenant token in my palm, had been carrying it all day, had stopped noticing it was there the way you stop noticing things that belong. Then I looked at Caedran, who was watching me from across the fire with that fixed, careful attention. You gave me this already? I said. Yes, he said. Did you know what that meant? When you gave it, the fire shifted. Somewhere outside, a night bird called and was answered. I gave it because it was right, he said. Not because of the covenant. You're a surprisingly terrible liar for an alpha. The ghost of that almost smile. On this particular matter, he said, very quietly, I am not lying. I believed him. That was the problem. I believed him completely, in the way you believe things that are said without decoration or agenda, said simply because they are true, and truth tends to land differently than everything else. Elder Marin let the silence breathe for exactly as long as it needed to, and then said, with the practicality of a woman who had watched 400 years of human sentiment complicate things that need not be complicated, "The blood moon is in 2 nights. If the covenant is not renewed, the old protections dissolve. Harwick's iron crosses the forest border unchallenged. My wolves have nowhere to run. And if I won't do it?" I asked. "Then you won't do it. The covenant demands a free choice. Always." I stood. I went to the tent's entrance and looked out at the dark forest, the ancient trees, the cold sky beginning to turn at its edges where the blood moon was climbing, the campfires of the pack spread through the trees like scattered embers. Behind me, I felt Caedran stand and cross the space between us. He stopped just behind me, close enough that I could feel his warmth without touching. "My mother made this choice," I said, half to myself. "Lyra." His voice low and careful. "I won't ask this of you. Whatever Marin says. I know. This isn't your war." I turned to face him. He was closer than I had realized, close enough that I had to look up to hold his eyes. In the firelight from the camp, his scar caught the light and the shadows alternately, and his amber eyes were very dark, and he looked like a man trying very hard to mean what he was saying and finding it cost him something. "My mother is dead because of Harwick," I said. "These people, your people, have lived in these woods for 400 years. They held the line against things the village never even knew were there. When did it stop being my war?" He looked at me for a long moment with something undisguised for the first time. Not the careful, composed attention of before, not the alpha's studied watchfulness, something rawer and quieter and more difficult to look at directly. "You should know something," he said, "before you decide. Wolves who share the covenant mark, they don't forget. It's not a wolf saying, and it's not a romantic notion. It is simply true. Whatever this becomes, whatever happens after, I will not forget. Even if you go back to your village and your cottage when this is over. Even if you decide this was all obligation and nothing more. Caedran, I'm telling you now, so there is no confusion later." I reached up and pressed my palm flat against his chest. I felt his heartbeat, steady, deep, relentless as a tide. He covered my hand with his, and we stood like that for a moment that had no business being as significant as it was. "I'm not going to leave," I said. His exhale was very slow. The following day was a war fought in ledgers and silence. I went back to my cottage in the early morning, retrieved my mother's documentation, 3 years of careful record-keeping, precise and damning, and by midday I had sent a letter to the Duke's traveling magistrate, who was known to be staying at the inn at Ashfin's southern end while conducting a routine survey of the region's tax records. The letter was polite. The evidence I described was not. The magistrate was a small, dry, deliberate man named Eldrin, who had the look of someone who had spent 40 years making very careful decisions and was not about to stop. He met me at the inn and read through the first ledger in complete silence. Then he read through the second. Then he asked me 3 very precise questions in a very precise order. Then he set the documents down and looked at me over his spectacles and said that he would like to see the rest. I showed him the rest. By evening, a plan had taken shape, rough and risky and dependent on several things going exactly right, which was the nature of plans that might actually matter. Meanwhile, back in the Thornwood, Harwick had moved. Soren scouts reported 20 soldiers on the forest road at dusk, torches lit, advancing in a formation that made their purpose unmistakable. They were not searching. They were surrounding. I returned to camp as the blood moon rose, fat and red and extraordinary over the Thornwood's canopy. Caedran was marshalling the pack with a quiet efficiency that was something to witness. No raised voice, no drama, simply clear direction given to people who trusted the person giving it. He saw me come through the tree line and crossed to me immediately, scanning my face before anything else. "The magistrate," he said. "He's coming. Tonight, if we can get word to him. Soren can run it. Then I need you to do something extremely dangerous and slightly mad. Something that was almost certainly a smile moved through his expression. I suspected you might. I need Harwick in one place. One specific place where the magistrate can hear him. I looked at him steadily. The clearing at the Thornwood's heart. He'll come if he thinks he has you cornered. The almost smile became something more genuine and considerably more alarming. You want me to be bait. I want you to be extremely visible and apparently alone. In the clearing where the covenant renewal happens. Under the blood moon, yes. He looked at me for a long, assessing moment. You have planned this very completely. I've had a day. Lyra. I know. I know it's dangerous. I know it depends on Soren reaching the magistrate in time, and Harwick taking the bait, and me being able to hold it all together without. I stopped. Started again. I know all of it. But Harwick will not stop. He will not stop at the forest, and he will not stop at your pack, and he will not stop until something stops him. And the law is the only thing that can stop him permanently without making you the kind of monster in the village's eyes that he has been trying to convince them you are. He reached out and tucked the same strand of hair back from my face, the same gesture as the morning before, deliberate, familiar already in a way that should not have been possible in 24 hours. When this is over, he said, we are going to have a very long conversation. About the covenant? Among other things. Soren was already gone before Caedran finished the sentence, sprinting through the Thornwood as a wolf, faster than torchlight. The clearing at the Thornwood's heart was extraordinary in the way that very old places sometimes are, a sense of the ground itself remembering things, a hush that was not silence, but accumulation. The trees stood back in a perfect ring as though they had chosen to, as though the space had been arranged rather than grown. The blood moon filled it from above, enormous and red, and everything the light touched turned the color of old copper. Caedran stood in the clearing center and waited. He had the patience of stone and the stillness of deep water, and he stood with his arms loose at his sides and his amber eyes fixed on the tree line, and he looked, in that moment, like the thing he was, something ancient and singular and not quite of the ordinary world. Harwick arrived with 10 soldiers and the bright, sick light of victory in his eyes. He pulled his horse up at the clearing's edge and looked at Caedran with a satisfaction so complete it had curdled into something ugly. A lone wolf, he said. How disappointing. I expected something more theatrical. The theater is arriving, Caedran said, and his voice in the clearing was very calm. I walked out of the trees with a lantern and my mother's document case, and I watched Harwick's face make several very rapid adjustments. You, he said. Me, I agreed. And the Duke's traveling magistrate, who has been standing at the northern edge of this clearing for the past 7 minutes. Magistrate Eldrin stepped forward from the shadows between the trees. He was carrying his own lantern and a leather portfolio that contained, among other things, a summary of every raid, every unlawful seizure, every documented act of violence against the people of Ashvin across 3 years of my mother's careful record-keeping. He moved with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that speed was not the point. Weight was the point. Harwick's horse shifted beneath him.
His jaw tightened.
He looked from me to the magistrate to Caedran and back, and I watched him run the calculation, watched him assess whether there was still a path through this that ended in his favor, and watched the moment he understood there was not. Magistrate, he said, carefully. You're out very late. I received a remarkable report, Eldrin said. His voice was as dry and precise as everything else about him, detailing raids on the village of Ashvin across the past 3 years.
Deaths.
Burned structures. Illegal tax levies against the Duke's own covenant roads. The documentation is extensive, my lord. Your name appears throughout. Documents can be fabricated, Harwick said. These were not. I have corroborating testimony from 6 independent witnesses in the village, secured this afternoon. Eldrin removed a sealed document from the portfolio. You will accompany me to the Duke's court. This is not a request. Harwick's hand went to his sword. Caedran moved 1 step toward me. 1 step. Nothing aggressive, nothing showy. He simply positioned himself between Harwick's drawn hand and where I stood, immovable as the trees. His amber eyes were very steady. Harwick looked at him, at me, at the magistrate's seal catching the moonlight. Kill the wolf, he said to his soldiers. The words came out cracked at the edges, and his soldiers heard it, heard the fracture in them, and looked at each other, and looked at the Duke's seal, and did not move. "My Lord Harwick," Eldrin said, "stand down, or you answer to the Duke for assault upon a Covenant envoy. The wolf is under Covenant protection, declared this evening under my official witness. Any hand raised against him is raised against the Duke's law." The clearing was absolutely still. Then Harwick's hand fell, slowly, like something draining. He looked at me with a hatred so refined it had become almost abstract, and I met it with everything I had, which was steadier than I expected, because standing next to Caedran with the blood moon overhead and my mother's work finally coming to something felt, in that moment, like having solid ground under my feet for the first time in 3 years. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is for tonight," I said. Eldrin moved forward with his 2 attendants. The soldiers parted. Harwick dismounted and allowed himself to be escorted from the clearing, and his men filed after him, and the forest received the sound of their torches and their footsteps and gradually swallowed it, and the clearing was quiet. For a moment I simply stood and breathed. Then a shaking laugh escaped me. Not hysteria, just the physical release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and Caedran turned from watching the tree line to look at me, and the expression on his face was entirely new. Not the careful, composed attention of before. Something open and warm and direct. That worked. I managed. "You were magnificent," he said. I was terrified. "I know. You were still magnificent." He crossed the clearing to where I stood and took my hand and held it with that deliberate, unhurried quality that I was learning was fundamental to how he moved through the world, like there was nothing to rush toward, like the thing worth having was already here. "Merrin said the Covenant renewal has to happen tonight," I said. "Blood moon." "Yes." "A free promise. On both sides." "Yes." I looked up at him. The moon made everything red and silver and impossible. "What would you promise me, Caedran?" He took a long breath. His thumb moved in slow circles over my knuckles, and I thought he was going to speak carefully, diplomatically, in the measured way of an alpha addressing a covenant. Instead he said, "That no one who wears this mark will ever stand alone. That the Thornwood will shelter your people as your people have sheltered mine." A pause. The circles on my knuckles slowed. Stopped. "That I will remember your name every day I live, whether you want that or not." My heart was in my throat. "And what would you want from me?" I asked. "Only what you choose to give." I stepped up, closed the last distance between us, the last several inches of careful space I had been maintaining since the moment he had appeared on my hearth rug, and pressed my lips to his cheek. Just the edge of his mouth. Deliberate. Warm. He went completely still the way things go still in the moment before they become something new. When I drew back, his eyes were very dark. "I promise to remember your name too," I said. He exhaled slowly, like a tide going out. His hands came up and cupped my face, both of them, thumbs at my temples, tilting me up toward him with a gentleness that was its own kind of undoing, and he looked at me for one long, suspended moment with everything he had not said accumulated in his expression. "Lyra Ashwood," he said. "Caedran Duskmore," I said. When he kissed me, it was not tentative, and it was not careful, and it was not the thing I had told myself in every sensible moment over the past 2 days that it could not be. It was certain. It was thorough and warm and deep, with the weight of a decision already made, and I grabbed a fistful of his shirt and kissed him back with everything I had been carrying since the night I opened my door and found a wolf with amber eyes looking at me as though he had known I would be there. Above us, the blood moon burned. The covenant mark grew warm in my closed fist. Somewhere at the clearing's edge, Soren turned to Elder Merrin and said something quietly satisfied that I was too occupied to hear. Whatever it was, Merrin told him to go away. Everything was the same in my cottage. Same herbs drying from the rafters. Same candles. Same hearth rug, somewhat repaired. Same view from the window of the Thornwood standing green and ancient at the village's edge. But there was a second mug of tea on the table, and boots that were not mine at the door, and the particular quality of quiet that belongs to a place that has more than one person in it, even when one of those people is currently outside splitting firewood with an efficiency that suggests he has not quite made peace with the concept of moderation. I listened to the steady rhythm of it and ground my herbs and thought about my mother. She was right about the wolves. She was right about the covenant and the forest and what it means to choose something bigger than yourself and hold on with both hands. She was right that the old agreements were worth keeping, that the wolves had kept faith across 4 centuries while the human lords came and went with their charters and their ambitions and their torches. She was right about all of it. She just had not told me that wolves are warm, or that an alpha's idea of protecting someone looks a great deal like staying for breakfast, or that the blood moon leaves a mark on you that has nothing whatsoever to do with magic and everything to do with the specific moment you stopped being afraid of what you might want. The door opened. Cold morning air. The sound of wood stacked against the outer wall. Caedran came in ducking the low frame. He always ducked the low frame, and I suspected he always would, and I suspected I would never entirely stop finding it endearing, and looked at me over the rising steam of the mug I held out to him. His amber eyes were warm in the morning light. That scar.
That jaw.
The particular expression that was his version of entirely content, which looked to most people like nothing at all, but which I had learned to read the way you learn to read weather. Lord Harwick's case was proceeding at the Duke's court. The garrison was gone from the road. The magistrate had sent word that the documentation was damning and the outcome predictable. The Thornwood was quiet in the way that the Thornwood had once been quiet, before the 3 months of iron and crossbow bolts and men who wanted what did not belong to them. The covenant held. I thought about telling him that, about saying it aloud to see if it sounded as settled as it felt. But then he sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at me with that particular amber attention, and I decided the covenant did not need saying. Some things are simply true, and the truth of them is in the doing rather than the telling. My mother was right about the wolves. And so do I.